Hi. The Apostle Paul was an arrogant jerk. Consequently, he couldn't get along with the other apostles. In fact, I'm not sure Paul could get along with much of anybody. He was constantly trying to bolster himself and make himself look better than everybody else. He attacked pretty much everybody he came in contact with. According to the Bible, Barnabas worked with Paul, and on one of their journeys, he wanted to take Mark along. But Paul didn't like that idea since Mark had failed to complete another journey with them. I guess Paul didn't like giving people second chances, like the second chance he got after murdering a bunch of Christians. He and Barnabas argued so strongly that they ended up parting ways too. Paul complained that Demas had forsaken him, having loved this present world. We might think that means Demas decided to start living a life of sin, but it's possible that Demas simply taught something different than Paul did. Perhaps Demas disagreed with Paul about whether Jews were to continue to obey the law. That was the present world that was, at that time, coming to an end. And Paul was always putting down other Christians who wanted to obey the law. The Old Covenant was, according to Jesus, supposed to be in effect until everything was fulfilled. And until that happened, this idea of continuing to obey the law caused confusion among the apostles regarding whether the Gentile Christians were to keep the law as the Jews were doing. Acts 15:1-2 says that some men from Jerusalem tried to force law keeping on the Gentiles. Verse 2 says, when therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. Not pray, mind you. They had to go talk to the people at the top of the hierarchy. And I'll deal with that a little bit more in a minute. I get that Paul probably had an inferiority complex when it came to the other apostles. Paul basically declared himself to be an apostle. He never knew Jesus, and he really wasn't qualified to be an apostle. According to Acts 1:22-23, an apostle had to be someone who had been with the others from the baptism of John until Jesus was taken up, and who was also a witness to the resurrection of Jesus. That was not Paul. So he was always trying to make himself look superior to the rest. He attacked Peter when Peter refused to eat with the Gentiles. Galatians 2:12 WB says, for before some came from James, he, Peter, ate with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. Now there could be several reasons why Peter did this. One, he felt it was the right thing to do, and that he had been wrong in the past. Two, he was refraining from eating meat for the sake of his weak brothers that had showed up, so as not to offend them. Paul is the one who said to do that. And three, perhaps Paul was right and Peter feared the circumcision. All we know for sure is that James was adamant that Jews were to continue to follow the law of Moses. In fact, on one occasion, James forced Paul to do the same thing because he knew that Paul wasn't following the law and was persuading others not to follow the law. James had to put a stop to this. Acts 21:18-26 says Paul was with James and all the elders talking about how Yahweh had done amazing things among the Gentiles through his ministry. However, James and the elders weren't happy about the fact that Paul was telling the Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake the law of Moses and not to circumcise their sons or walk according to the Jewish customs. So they called together an assembly. Do what we tell you, they said to Paul. They told Paul to take 4 men who had a vow, purify himself with them, and pay their expenses so they could shave their heads. Verse 24 states, then all will know that there is no truth in the things that they have been informed about you, but that you yourself also walk keeping the law. The passage goes on to say in verse 26, then Paul took the men, and the next day purified himself and went with them into the temple, declaring the fulfillment of the days of purification until the offering was offered for every one of them. So James and the elders in Jerusalem forced Paul to purify himself in the temple and to make an offering, which we can only assume was a blood sacrifice. And my guess is that Paul was none too happy about this. See, Paul didn't want to keep the law. He wanted Peter not to keep the law too. Christians today think Paul was right in reprimanding Peter for not eating with the Gentiles. But remember that Paul is the one telling the story. He twisted it to make it seem that Peter was compelling the Gentiles to live as Jews, but the truth is that Peter may have simply been trying to follow the law by not eating with the Gentiles himself. He certainly thought the law required this based on Acts 10:28, where he says, "You yourselves know how it is an unlawful thing for a man who is a Jew to join himself or come to one of another nation." Paul thought he knew more than the original apostles. He thought he did more than they did too. He bragged about this. He said, "But by the grace of God I am what I am. His grace was bestowed on me. His grace which was bestowed on me was not futile, but I worked more than all of them." I reckon that I am not at all behind the very best apostles. Paul wanted preeminence, and he pushed Jews to deny the teachings of James and the other apostles to follow Paul instead. He tried to force an end to the law before it was time. And because of this, James, Peter, and John thought it best that Paul leave the Jewish Christians and work only among the Gentiles. He was wreaking havoc among the Jews, so he needed to hit the road. These men angered Paul, of course, as did most people, and he criticized them and tried to put them down. In Galatians 2:6, he said, "But from those who were reputed to be important, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God doesn't show partiality to man. They, I say, who were respected, imparted nothing to me." He had just talked about going up to Jerusalem to meet with the other apostles, and now he's claiming they taught him absolutely nothing. Then he said in verse 9, "James and Cephas and John, they who were reputed to be the pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcision." As somewhat of an aside here, I want to comment on the fact that the Jews were still obeying the law of Moses, even after the church was established. There are people who believe that the entire Bible is for the Israelites and that the Gentiles mentioned are really just the 10 lost tribes of Israel that are being gathered back with the Jews. They don't think the Bible applies to the Gentiles, to true Gentiles. These people are known as Israel only, or I.O. preterists, and I hope they're okay with that terminology. Now, they make some very good points, and I certainly am not capable of arguing with them. However, I do have a couple of thoughts on the subject. Remember part 1 of my discussion on Paul? I talked about the seed of Abraham that was to be blessed through Jesus. Well, in that discussion, I didn't mention a couple of verses in Galatians 3. The first is verse 26, which says, "Ye are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus." And the second is 29, which reads, "And if ye be Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise." So these Gentiles were of the seed of Abraham and heirs to the promise, but not by blood. It was instead by faith. But if those who follow I.O. are right, and James was right that he and Paul and all the Jews were to continue to obey the law of Moses, then it seems to me that Paul and even James were wrong not to make these Gentiles, that were really Israelites, obey the law as well. Even James didn't want the law put on the Gentiles. However, if they were actually the 10 lost tribes of Israel, as the I.O. preterists claim, then why shouldn't they obey the law of Moses, the same as James and Paul? They were Israelites. They were as obligated to obey the law of Moses as the Jews were. At least it seems that way to me. The fact that we have different views on this, as well as many other issues in the Bible, helps show what a confusing mess the whole thing is. Yahweh apparently wasn't capable of giving us a book we could all understand. Before resuming my discussion of Paul, I want to make one other side point. Have you ever thought much about the fact that the apostles didn't always agree with one another? All of them were supposedly led by the Spirit, yet they disagreed. So at least some of them weren't being led by the Spirit. So how did they decide who was right? Well, as we saw in Acts 15, 6 through 7, they came together and hashed it out amongst themselves just like we do. James wanted to keep the law of Moses. Paul said the Jews were dead to the law. I think most Christians think Paul knew more than James, although, as we know, James walked and talked with Jesus and Paul never saw the man. The point is that these men gathered as a council to discuss matters that troubled them. They shared their views, which weren't always the same. So there was no inspiration telling them, all of them, what to do. They had to figure it all out for themselves. The Holy Spirit, who was supposed to guide them into all truth, was apparently falling down on the job. In Acts 2, when they were choosing an apostle to take the place of Judas, they cast lots. That was basically voting. The lot fell on Matthias. I assume that means that he received at least 6 of the 11 votes. So they decided that Yahweh had chosen Matthias. The truth, of course, is that they chose Matthias. Either that or Yahweh took away their free will and forced the majority to cast the lots for Matthias. This, of course, brings up another point. When people today say that Yahweh put something on their heart, all they really mean is that a thought came to them and they pretended it came from Yahweh. And that's what the apostles and elders of the first century CE did as well. But finally, back to Paul. It was good, for Paul at least, that James and Peter and the others shipped him off to the Gentiles because the Gentiles were ignorant. They didn't know the law. So Paul could make stuff up as he went along, which is what he did. The point here is that Paul was a mess, and he had to be top dog, even if it was by hook or crook. Nobody could tell him a thing. Among the Gentiles, he could make that happen. But I do have to chuckle when Peter, I got lost. I do have to chuckle when I think about how Paul bragged about withstanding Peter to his face. When Peter wouldn't eat with the Gentiles, saying to Peter, if you being a Jew are living like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how will you make the Gentiles do the same as the Jews? But then, when he himself got backed into the corner in front of James and the elders in Jerusalem, whose preeminence supposedly meant nothing to him, he scurried off to the temple and offered a sacrifice. A sacrifice! You gotta love the hypocrisy of Paul. He was, as he was accused of being, big and bold on paper, and to someone like Peter, but not so brave in front of James and the whole company of elders up there in the big city of Jerusalem. This is the end of my discussion of Paul, and I want to say that he may have been highly intelligent. He may well have been a Hebrew scholar. He may not have even existed at all, for all I know. Some people don't believe he did. But all I can go on is what is in the Bible. And the person who has taken on this persona does not present as a Hebrew scholar. He doesn't present as a good guy. He presents as an arrogant man who loves preeminence. And he was a liar, willing to say anything to gain followers. Of course, there's always the possibility that his words were added to or tampered with, but no matter how we look at Paul, the bottom line is that his teachings that we supposedly have from him are not trustworthy and not words we should rely on or base our lives on. And Paul and his bad character and crazy teaching are just another example of why we can throw the whole book out. It's not from a God. Thanks for watching. Bye.